This week's bad argument of the day is definitely going to bake your noodle a little bit. It's about background checks. Why background checks don't work that great, but not for the reasons that you think. The pro-gun control argument for background checks generally goes something like, background checks work, and we need to expand background checks in order to prevent guns from winding up in the wrong hands. Reasonable people can agree that this kind of common sense measure is necessary. It might seem totally obvious that if any background check has ever stopped the wrong person from getting a gun, then more background checks must be more better. And because we can all agree that people with malicious intent, be it the result of a sane or ill mind, should not have access to weapons, then screening people at the point of purchase is a reasonable thing to do.
Assuming this does anything to address or interdict the method by which most criminals obtain their guns. And it doesn't. Most guns used in crime are from underground sales that are already illegal, or transfers that would not be subject to a background check anyway, like transfers between relatives.
Expanding background checks has a serious math problem which will prevent them from ever being effective. Stick with me, because this is going to involve some counterintuitive freakonomics. I was personally never good at math, so I have to have this explained to me in crayon to really grasp it, but once you get it, not only will you feel smarter for knowing it, but you'll also see it everywhere. So strap on your thinking cap and follow along with me. I have here the data for 2017. In that year, there were over 25 million NICS background checks. That's 25 million people walking into a gun store, filling out their paperwork, and legally buying a gun. 180,000 of those background checks were denied. That's less than 1%. Of those 180,000 denials, a mere 12,000 were investigated by the ATF. Of those 12,000 investigations, there were 12 federal prosecutions. That's about one federal prosecution per 2 million background checks.
Wow.
Now, this is just federal data. Some states are investigating and prosecuting some of these denials through their own systems, but a lot of them just don't or can't follow up with all of them.
Okay, so there's a lot of denials that don't get followed up on, but aren't we still stopping something like 180,000 prohibited people from getting guns?
If all of those people were actually correctly prohibited from owning a gun, and if none of them went on to buy a gun on the black market, someone might be able to claim that victory. But something like 90% of these cases don't meet referral guidelines or get overturned on review. That's the long way of saying that those are all false positives. A person who has no criminal record or reason to be prohibited from buying a gun.
So something like you have the same name and birthday as a prohibited person and you get mixed up in the system?
Yeah, it's like a no-fly list.
Given the rate at which the millions of people who are subject to background checks actually do something dangerous or illegal, which is nearly zero, and given the rate at which failed background checks are investigated and prosecuted, also nearly zero, background checks have a higher likelihood of generating false positives than true positives.
Remember that discrepancy for later in this argument.
Okay.
This is the same problem that the TSA has. If you're screening every single passenger, each of whom has a microscopically unlikely chance of being a terrorist, the resources of the system will be consumed with identifying and investigating false positives at the expense of true positives. Which is why, despite screening every passenger with a degree of rigorousness and invasion which becomes inconvenient, the TSA fails to detect somewhere between 70 and 90% of contraband in their own internal evaluations. The notion that screening is effective results from a cognitive bias called the base rate fallacy, or base rate neglect. This is the good part. In our case, we're subject to a subset of that called the false positive paradox. Given my dismal math skills, I've kind of had to simplify this for myself in order to fully understand it, but this will put a pretty strong crease in your brain once you get this, so bear with me.
Bring it on.
Here's the core of the problem. Let's say you're looking for needles in a haystack. You have a handy needle detector to make your life easier. You know for sure that one sample in every 1,000 samples is going to be a needle. You just need to find them quickly and accurately before your cows eat them by accident. The needle detector works awesome. It beeps every single time it finds a needle. Guaranteed.
Every time?
Every time. But since nothing is perfect, 5% of the time it beeps, that's because it thinks some hay is a needle. So if the machine beeps, what are your chances that you've detected a needle?
Well, if it's wrong 5% of the time, then there's a 95% chance it's correct, right?
You'd think that. but it's actually way lower. And here comes the math part. If 1 in every 1,000 samples is in fact a needle, and 5% are false positives, that means that 50 samples in every 1,000 are false positive. That means that a beep indicates a 1 in 50 chance that the machine is correct. The probability that you've detected a needle when that machine beeps is 2%.
So you're shoveling hay into your needle detector and it's beeping away, separating needles from the hay. And this whole time it's just making another haystack?
Expanding background checks is like thinking you're going to find more needles by starting with a bigger haystack. If anything, we should be starting with a smaller haystack.
Well, hell, forget the haystack. We need to go to the needle factory and turn off the needle machine.
Using data-driven, evidence-based policing, combined with programs to improve social, economic, and environmental conditions in high-crime neighborhoods, we should be making positive interventions into the lives of those most negatively affected by violence, instead of wasting resources on impersonal and ineffective population-level solutions. This is why intelligence agencies catch more terrorists than the TSA does. We should be addressing this at the needle level, not the haystack level.